At 68 years old, I thought I had already used up every kind of surprise life had left for me, until my daughter Claire caught me looking at a man across my own dinner table and asked in that flat, careful voice she uses when she already suspects the answer, "Mom, since when?" I did not answer right away. I could not because I was still watching Gerald Whittaker laugh at something my grandson had said, the way the corners of his eyes creased, the way his gaze kept drifting back to me between bites of pot roast like he needed to check. I was still there, and I realized I had been caught doing something I had not done in 4 years. I had been looking at a man the way a woman looks at someone she is falling for, openly, without apology, at my own table, in front of my own daughter, with my late husband's china still in the cabinet behind us. I set down my fork. I did not have a clever answer ready. All I had was the truth, and the truth, as it turned out, took a good deal longer to tell than the question that asked for it. Let me take you back, though, because if I only gave you that dinner table and my daughter's raised eyebrow, you would not understand why my hands went cold before I answered her, or why it took a woman my age nearly a year to admit what a room full of strangers had apparently already noticed. So let me take you back to a gray Tuesday in April, in the town of Cedar Hollow, Vermont, 4 years after I buried my husband Frank, to a folding table in the basement of the Fairview Senior Center, where a retired history teacher set down a pan of cornbread across from me and said good evening, like it was nothing at all. Frank had been gone 4 years by then. Though grief does not organize itself so neatly into units of time as people like to believe, he died on an ordinary October afternoon, raking leaves in the front yard while I made soup inside. And by the time I noticed he had been out there too long and went to check, he was already gone, sitting against the maple tree he had planted the year our daughter was born, his rake still in his hand. I was a nurse for 31 years. I have held the hands of strangers while they died, and told their families the kind of gentle, practice things you say in those rooms, and none of that training prepared me for the particular silence of my own kitchen. The first morning I woke up and did not have to make 2 cups of coffee. I kept making 2 anyway, for the better part of a year, until I finally admitted to myself that pouring the second cup down the sink every morning was not honoring him. It was just a wound I had built a ritual around. Claire wanted me to sell the house after the funeral, move somewhere smaller, somewhere with less yard to keep and fewer rooms to echo in, and I told her I was not ready, which was true, though what I did not tell her was that I was not sure I would ever be ready, that the house with Frank's recliner still angled toward the television and his coat still hanging by the back door had become less a home and more a museum I curated out of loyalty. I kept his rose garden, which he had babied for 20 years along the south fence, more out of stubbornness than love of gardening, because letting the roses die felt like one more small betrayal I could not bring myself to commit. I went to church on Sundays and sat in the same pew we had shared for 3 decades, now with an empty space beside me that I noticed every single week, the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue. I went back to work part-time at the hospital for a while, but the shifts felt heavier without someone waiting at home, and eventually I let that go too. Claire called every Sunday evening at exactly 7, the way she had since the funeral, and I learned to recognize the particular careful cheerfulness in her voice, the tone of a daughter checking whether her mother had eaten a real dinner or just toast standing over the sink, whether the house still smelled like anything besides dust, and the candle I burned out of habit more than pleasure. I never lied to her exactly. I only left out the parts that would have worried her, the nights I sat in Frank's recliner instead of my own chair because it still held his shape, the mornings I found myself talking to his photograph on the mantel about nothing in particular, weather and grocery prices and the leak in the gutter. The way you talk to someone you have simply not yet accepted is not going to answer. My best friend Dot Ferris, who had buried her own husband 9 years before mine, and had appointed herself something like a grief chaplain to the widows of Cedar Hollow, kept telling me I needed to get out of that house more than twice a week for church and groceries. "You're going to turn into wallpaper, Vivian," she told me over coffee one morning, not unkindly. I did it too, for the first 3 years, sitting in that quiet house talking to a man who can't answer you back. It isn't living, it's just waiting. I told her I was not waiting for anything. She looked at me over her cup with the particular patience of a woman who has heard that exact denial from every widow she has ever known, and said only, "That's what we all say, dear, right up until we stop." It was Dot who finally talked me into the Thursday potluck suppers at the Fairview Senior Center, a low brick building with folding tables and fluorescent lights, and a coffee urn that had probably been there since Nixon was in office, where 20 or so widows and widowers of Cedar Hollow gathered once a week to eat casseroles and play cards and pretend, for a few hours, that the evenings were not quite so long. I went the first time mostly to get Dot to stop asking, and I sat at the edge of a folding table with a plate of somebody's tuna casserole and watched the room the way I imagine new nurses watch a hospital floor on their first shift, cataloging faces, learning who belonged to whom, feeling entirely like a woman standing outside her own life, looking in through a window. That was the night I first noticed Gerald Whittaker, though noticing is too strong a word for what happened, because what actually happened is that Dot pointed her fork at a tall, silver-haired man refilling the coffee urn and said, "That's Jerry Whittaker. Taught history at the high school for 30-some years. His wife Helen passed about 6 years back, cancer, nice man, terrible cornbread, brings it every week anyway and nobody has the heart to tell him." I laughed, the first real laugh I remembered having in months, and Jerry, hearing it from across the room, glanced over with a small, curious smile, as though he was pleased someone had found something funny in a room that mostly ran on quiet grief and card games. For the better part of a year, that was more or less the extent of it. Jerry and I would nod at each other across the folding tables. He would ask, in passing, how my week had gone, and I would ask about his garden, because Dot had mentioned he grew tomatoes with the kind of devotion most men reserve for their grandchildren. We played in the same bridge foursome sometimes, when a fourth was needed, and I learned he had a habit of humming old hymns under his breath when he was concentrating on his cards, and that he still wore his wedding ring, which I understood completely, because I still wore mine too, a small brass ring in the shape of a match set of loneliness that neither of us mentioned out loud. I want to be honest with you about something, the way I was not entirely honest with my daughter that first evening at the dinner table. There was no lightning bolt. There was no moment in that first year where I looked at Gerald Whittaker and felt my heart do something dramatic. We were simply two widowed people who had been given, by circumstance, the same folding chairs in the same fluorescent basement once a week, both of us privately convinced that whatever it felt like to be looked at with real interest had been buried, in his case with Helen, and in mine with Frank, permanently and without appeal. The other regulars at the Fairview Senior Center noticed things long before Jerry and I did. The way people in small, familiar rooms always seem to know a story before its own characters have read the first page. There was a widower named Earl Sutton who ran the Thursday card games with the seriousness of a man overseeing a courtroom, and he liked to remind anyone who would listen that he had been watching the two of us angle our folding chairs a little closer together for months before either of us admitted anything. "You two have been circling each other since the leaves turned," Earl told me once, dealing out a hand of gin rummy he had no intention of letting me win. "Some of us just move slower than others. That's not a flaw, Vivian. That's just arithmetic. We've all buried somebody. Takes longer to trust the math again." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, the way I said nothing to most things that first year, and went back to shuffling my own cards. The evening that changed things arrived, as these things so often do, through nothing more dramatic than an old sedan that would not start. It was late October, almost exactly 4 years to the week since I had lost Frank, and I remember thinking, standing in the Fairview parking lot with my key in the ignition and my engine making a clicking sound that meant nothing good, that grief has a way of keeping a calendar even when you have stopped keeping one yourself. I sat there for a moment feeling unreasonably close to tears over a dead battery, which is the particular indignity of loneliness, that small failures start to feel like proof of something larger, and that was when Jerry knocked on my window, his own keys already in his hand. "Battery?" he asked, and I nodded, embarrassed, and he said without making any fuss of it, "I've got cables in my trunk. Give me 2 minutes." He got my car running in the cold dark of that parking lot, breath fogging between us, and when I thanked him, he waved it off and said, "Any man who taught high school for 30 years has jumped 100 dead batteries in student parking lots. This one was easy. You didn't even ask me twice for extra credit." I laughed again, that same surprised laugh from the coffee urn night, and he looked at me for a moment longer than the joke required, and something in the parking lot air shifted, though neither of us named it. After that, small things began to change without either of us deciding anything on purpose. Jerry started saving me a seat at the potluck, angled just slightly toward his own, and I started noticing when he was not there before I noticed anything else about the room. He mentioned, one Thursday, that he had a stack of library books due back, and asked if I wanted to walk over with him afterward, since the library was only 4 blocks from the center and the evening was mild, And I said yes before I had fully decided to. The way you agree to small things, because saying no would require an explanation you are not ready to give even yourself. We walked slowly, the way people our age walk when neither one is in any hurry to get where they are going. And he told me about Helen, about the particular quiet of watching someone you love disappear slowly instead of all at once, about how he had kept teaching for 2 years after she passed because the classroom was the only place grief did not seem to follow him inside. I told him about Frank in the yard, about the rake still in his hand, about the second cup of coffee I had poured for a year out of habit before I let myself stop. Jerry listened, the way I imagine he once listened to nervous students explaining why an essay was late, patient and entirely present. And when I finished, he said only, "You don't stop loving someone just because they're gone. I think you just learn to carry it differently." I did not say anything back. I did not trust my voice. We began walking to the library, most Thursdays after that, and then some Saturdays too, when he would knock on my door with an excuse about a book he thought I might like. War histories mostly, because he knew Frank had served 2 tours, and I had once mentioned I liked reading about the wars my husband would never fully talk about. I started noticing things about myself that unsettled me a little. The way I checked the mirror before Thursday suppers in a way I had not bothered to in years. The way I found myself thinking about what Jerry might say about something funny that happened at the grocery store, saving up small stories for him the way you save good news for someone you are used to sharing your life with. One evening in December, walking back from the library, with snow just starting to fall, Jerry stopped under a street lamp and said, with the particular bluntness I was learning belonged only to him, "Vivian, I think I've been walking you to the library for 2 months because I like the walking, not the books." I wanted to say that honestly, because pretending otherwise felt like a disservice to both of us at our age. I stood there in the snow feeling something crack open in my chest that had been sealed for 4 years, and I told him, because it was true and because he had earned honesty with his own. I think I noticed that a few weeks ago and didn't know what to do with it. That admission should have made things simpler. And for a little while it did. But grief and guilt do not resolve themselves in straight lines, especially not at our age, when we have both already learned exactly how much a person can survive losing, and have therefore learned exactly how much we are willing to risk losing again. I went home that snowy night and stood in Frank's rose garden with my coat pulled tight around me, staring at the bare canes under a dusting of snow, and I said out loud, the way I sometimes did when the house felt too quiet to bear, that I did not know how to want something for myself again without it feeling like a betrayal of the 29 years I had spent wanting things for us. I waited, the way foolish widows do, for some sign, some rustle of wind through the dead rose canes, and none came, because that is not how the dead answer us. But somewhere in the act of saying the fear out loud instead of just carrying it silently, I understood that the only person keeping that garden gate closed was me. I stood out there long enough that the snow collected on my shoulders, thinking about the 29 years Frank and I had spent learning each other's rhythms. The way he took his coffee, the way he always left one dish in the sink for me to find in the morning, no matter how many times I asked him not to. Small, imperfect things I would have given almost anything to complain about again. Loving someone new did not feel, in that moment, like closing a door on any of that. It felt more like discovering the house had another room I had simply never had reason to open before, and I was not at all sure I was brave enough, at 68, to walk into it. I did not tell Claire any of this right away. That was, I think now, its own kind of cowardice, though at the time I told myself I was simply being careful, not wanting to make something real by naming it before I understood it myself. But Claire, like most daughters who have already lost one parent, has a very fine instrument for detecting change in the other. And she called me on a Sunday evening in January, her voice carrying that particular brightness mothers learn to recognize as suspicion, wearing a friendly coat. "Dot mentioned you've been walking to the library with someone," she said, and I could hear my 2 grandchildren shrieking in the background of her kitchen, could picture her leaning against her counter with the phone wedged against her shoulder, the way she always did when she wanted to sound casual about something that was not casual at all. I told her, carefully, that I had made a friend at the senior center, a nice man named Jerry, and that we sometimes walked to the library together. There was a pause on the line that lasted just a beat too long. "Mom," she said, "I just don't want you to get hurt. Or honestly, I don't want someone to take advantage of the fact that you're lonely and grieving. You hear about that happening. Men who find widows and see an easy situation. I understood, even as it stung, that her worry came from love, the same love that had made her cry when she thought I was disappearing into that house after Frank died. But it stung all the same, being spoken of like a vulnerability instead of a woman who had simply started noticing another human being again. I told her Jerry was not like that he had taught history to 3 decades of teenagers and buried a wife of his own, and had never once asked me for anything but company. And Claire said, in the careful voice of someone trying very hard to be reasonable about something that frightened her, I hope you're right. I just worry, Mom. Dad's only been gone 4 years. As though grief came with a minimum sentence that had not yet been served, as though there was some correct number of years a woman was required to serve before she was allowed to feel something again, without her own daughter treating it as a small betrayal. I did not argue with her that night. I only told her I would introduce her to Jerry sometime, when the time felt right, and I hung up feeling the particular loneliness of being loved by someone who does not yet understand what you need. She called again 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday, out of her usual Sunday rhythm, which told me she had been sitting with something the whole time. I looked him up, she admitted, a little sheepishly. Just to make sure. Gerald Whitaker, Cedar Hollow High School, 31 years teaching history. Volunteers at the library. Nothing strange, Mom. I promise I wasn't trying to snoop, She stopped herself. I just don't want to lose you the way I'm still losing Dad a little more every year, if that makes any sense. I told her it made every kind of sense, that I understood the fear better than she knew, because I carried a version of it myself every single Thursday I laced up my shoes to walk to that basement supper. I did not tell her about the parking lot yet, or the library walks, only that Jerry made me laugh in a way I had forgotten I still could, and she was quiet on the line for a moment before she said, I'd like to meet him eventually, just not yet. I need a little more time to get used to the idea before I have to be polite to his face. I told her that was fair. I did not tell her that I needed the same thing. That loneliness deepened in February, when Jerry had what the emergency room called a minor cardiac event, a flutter of arrhythmia that landed him overnight in the Cedar Hollow Hospital where I had worked for 3 decades, and I found myself sitting in a familiar waiting room on the wrong side of the desk for the first time in my career, wringing my hands the way I had watched 1,000 family members wring theirs over the years, understanding suddenly and completely why they always looked the way they looked. His son Daniel, who lived overseas and visited perhaps twice a year, could not get a flight home in time, and it was Dot who sat with me in that waiting room at 11 at night, patting my hand and saying nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say, until a nurse I recognized from my old floor came out and told me Jerry was stable, that it had been a scare and not a crisis, and that he was asking for me by name. I walked into that hospital room and saw him propped up against pillows, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, and something in my chest that I had kept very carefully controlled for 4 months simply gave way. I did not decide to cry. I only found that I was crying, holding his hand the way I had held 100 strangers' hands in that same building without ever once feeling what I felt standing there. He looked at me, his voice raspy from the oxygen mask they had only just removed, and said, You're not supposed to look that scared over a man you've only been walking to the library with. And I told him, because there was no more sense in hiding it from either of us. I think we both know it stopped being about the walking a while ago. He smiled at that, the particular smile of a man who has just been handed something he thought he would not be handed again, and said, Good. I was starting to think I'd have to have a real heart attack to get you to admit it. Dot drove me home from the hospital that night, well past midnight, and neither of us said much in the car, until she pulled into my driveway and put the car in park and said gently, You don't cry like that over a friend, Vivian. I think you know that. I did not answer her either, but I sat in my driveway a long while after she left, looking up at my dark kitchen window, and understood that some questions do not require an answer so much as the courage to stop pretending you have not already answered them. That scare changed something in me permanently. The way I imagine it changes anyone at our age who has already buried one person they built a life around. I understood, sitting in that hospital room, that I had spent 4 years protecting myself from ever feeling that particular fear again, the fear of almost losing someone, and that the protection had cost me something I had not fully calculated until I felt it slipping away in real time. When Jerry came home from the hospital, I brought him casseroles the way half of Cedar Hollow does for anyone who has a health scare, but I also started staying to eat them with him, sitting in his kitchen while he recovered, and one evening in March, with his tomato seedlings just starting to green up on the windowsill, he told me something he had apparently been thinking about since the hospital bed. "I don't know how many years I've got left, Vivian," he said plainly, the way a man who has spent 30 years explaining hard truths to teenagers tends to say things. "The doctor's not worried exactly, but he's watching things closer than he used to, and I've decided I'd rather spend whatever time I've got left walking you to the library on Thursdays than being careful with my heart in every sense of the word." I told him I understood that particular arithmetic better than he knew, that I had done the same math over Frank's rake in the yard, and that I was tired, finally, of being careful with what remained of my own life. "I love you, Jerry," I said, and I meant it with the particular clarity that only comes when you have already lost someone once and know exactly what it costs to lose them. I loved Frank for 29 years, and I don't think loving you erases a single day of that. I think my heart just turned out to have more room in it than 4 years of grief managed to convince me it did. Jerry took my hand across his kitchen table, his tomato seedlings green in the window behind him, and said, "Helen would have liked you. She always said the worst thing a person could do with a good long life was spend the second half of it afraid to live it." I cried again that evening. The good kind of crying, the kind that comes when a weight you had been carrying so long you forgot it was optional, finally gets set down. It was after that conversation that I finally invited Jerry to Sunday dinner. The dinner where Claire and her husband and my 2 grandchildren were already planning to visit. The dinner where my daughter would finally meet the man I had been carefully describing to her over the phone for months without ever quite letting her see him. I was more nervous that morning than I had been in years, ironing a blouse I had not bothered to iron since Frank's funeral. And Jerry showed up at my door in a collared shirt with a bouquet of grocery store carnations, which he handed to me with the particular formality of a man attending an occasion he understood mattered enormously. Claire was polite at first, the careful, watchful politeness of a daughter deciding whether to trust her own eyes, asking Jerry the kind of pointed, casual questions that are not casual at all, about his late wife, about his son overseas, about what exactly he wanted at this stage of his life. Jerry answered all of it honestly and without defensiveness, the way a man answers questions from a school board he respects rather than fears. And I watched Claire's shoulders loosen by degrees over the course of the meal. Watched her stop bracing for the wrong answer. It was somewhere over the pot roast, while I was telling a slightly exaggerated story about a rose bush that had nearly gotten the better of me that spring. That I noticed Jerry was not laughing along with everyone else at the joke. He was simply looking at me, the particular soft, unhurried way you look at someone you have decided, quietly and without ceremony, that you intend to keep looking at for as long as you are given. And I felt my own face go warm under that look, in a way it had not gone warm in longer than I wanted to admit out loud. That was the exact moment Claire caught the two of us, mid-sentence, mid-story. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth, watching her mother be looked at the way she had probably stopped believing her mother would ever be looked at again. She waited until we were doing dishes together afterward, the two of us alone at the sink while Jerry helped my grandson with a puzzle in the other room, before she finally said it, quiet enough that only I could hear. "Mom, since when?" I set down the plate I was drying and looked at my daughter, who was still watching me with an expression I could not entirely name, somewhere between surprise and something gentler underneath it. And I told her the truth, the whole slow arithmetic of it, the parking lot and the dead battery and the library walks and the hospital room and the tomato seedlings on the windowsill, the whole unhurried year it had taken 2 grieving people to admit they wanted to stop grieving alone. Claire was quiet for a long moment after I finished, drying the same plate longer than it needed. And then she said something I have not forgotten since. "I've been so worried about you being taken advantage of that I think I forgot to actually look at you, Mom. Really look. I haven't seen you look like that since before Dad got sick that last year. I think I was so scared of you getting hurt again that I didn't leave room to notice you were finally happy." She hugged me then, right there at the sink, with soap still on her hands. And when we came out of the kitchen, she walked straight over to where Jerry was helping my grandson with his puzzle, sat down beside him, and asked him, without any of the careful edge from earlier in the evening, what his tomatoes tasted like this time of year. I stood in the doorway watching my daughter and the man I loved talk easily about garden vegetables, and I understood that whatever guardedness had stood between us had simply, quietly dissolved, the way morning fog burns off a Vermont field once the sun finally clears the tree line. Jerry proposed 3 months later, in June, not with any great production, because neither of us had much use anymore for productions, but in his own garden among the tomato plants he had nursed back from that windowsill all spring, with Helen's memory and Frank's memory both, I think, quietly present in the way that the memory of people we have loved tends to stand just at the edge of every good thing that comes after them. He got down on one knee slowly, favoring the hip that had started giving him trouble, and told me that he did not know how many Thursdays he had left to walk me to the library, but that he intended to spend every single one of them finding out, if I would let him. I said yes before he had fully finished the sentence, the way you agree to the truest things in your life sometimes before your mind has caught up to your heart. We were married in September, in the backyard of the house Jerry and Helen had once shared, among his tomato plants and my transplanted rose canes, which I had dug up from Frank's garden and replanted there that summer, because I had finally understood that honoring the past and building a future were not opposite instructions, only two rooms in the same house. Claire walked me down the short garden aisle herself, since her father could not, and at the end of it she placed my hand in Jerry's and whispered, just loud enough for the two of us to hear, "Take care of her the way she deserves, and Mom, for what it's worth. I'm glad I finally got to see the way he looks at you." Dot sat in the front row in her good church dress, telling anyone who would listen that she had called it back in October, which was, strictly speaking, true. Earl Sutton came too, in a tie I had never once seen him wear to a card game, and told me afterward, gruffly, that he expected us both back at the Thursday table the very next week, married or not, because the fourth chair at Gin Rummy did not fill itself. Jerry's son Daniel flew in from overseas for the ceremony, the first time he had managed a visit in nearly 2 years, and stood beside his father looking, I thought, both a little stunned and a little grateful, the particular expression of a son realizing his father's life had kept moving forward in his absence, and being glad of it rather than threatened by it. I still keep a photograph of Frank on my nightstand. The two of us young and sunburned on a beach in Maine 40 years ago. And Jerry has never once asked me to put it away. He understood, without my needing to explain it in the careful, wounded language of a woman twice loved, that loving someone new does not require erasing someone old, that a heart at 68 is not a small house with only one room in it, but something with more doors than I had ever thought to look for, and that some of the finest rooms only open if you are brave enough, even after everything you have already lost, to walk through them. Frank used to say that the measure of a good marriage was whether you could still surprise each other after 30 years, and I think about that often now, sitting on Jerry's porch on Thursday evenings before we walk to the library together, watching him hum an old hymn under his breath while he waters his tomatoes. And I think if Frank could see me now, a widow with a good heart and a second chance she almost did not let herself take, he would not call it a betrayal. He would call it, I think, exactly the kind of surprise he always hoped I would still be capable of. Love does not end at our age. It only waits, patiently, for someone brave enough to look up from an old grief and notice they are being looked at again.